Hi, everyone, and welcome to Big Eye Kentucky's Minimizing Risk Inside Your Agency. So, I am Mary Pat Hartman, Workforce Development Director here at Big Eye, and we are delighted to have Carey Wallace back with us once again. Carey is the founder of the AgencyFocus and co host of the Insurance Refocused podcast. So, this is a 1 hour webinar. You will earn 1 hour of Kentucky CE. But of course, to qualify, you have to answer 3 polling questions that will just pop up on your screen during the webinar. Just answer yes to those, and then the webinar continues on. Also, at the end of the webinar, you will get a survey that will populate to your screen. Please take a minute and fill that out. That is the required Kentucky Department of Insurance webinar attendance affidavit. So we do need your recorded response to that also to keep on file for them. So during the webinar, participants are muted. Okay, the chat box also is not enabled, but use the Q&A box to communicate with Carey, ask her any questions you want, and she'll respond to those during the webinar. So we're good to get going. So let's get started with Carey. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Pat. You can see my screen, correct?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. This is one of my absolutely favorite topics to talk about. For those of you that don't know us, Agency Focus is designed to help agencies maximize the value of their agency by number one, providing valuation services, fractional CFO support, compensation analysis, etc. So this is our sweet spot. We only do this for independent insurance agents. So I love this topic and can't wait to jump in and share you what we know. So just to get started talking about the value of your agency, many agencies believe that the value of an agency is communicated in a multiple of revenue. That is the rule of thumb that many agency owners use in order to talk about the value of their agency. But in reality, if you've bought or sold an agency, or if you're thinking about buying or selling an agency, talking about it and calculating the value of an agency as a multiple of revenue can actually be a dangerous thing because not all agencies are created equal. And certainly not one line item on your financial statement is the thing that you should use as your guide to talk about the value of your agency. It's actually based on what the ongoing profit or EBITDA is of your agency, and the multiple you would apply to that EBITDA is what gets you to the value of an agency. Two of the biggest factors inside an agency that will determine that multiple is the agency growing and is it profitable? And then all the other risk factors that we think about is whether or not that agency is transferable if that agency owner changes. Is there anything inside that agency that would cause the performance to change if the owner changed, if one employee changed, if the carrier makeup changed, if something happened in one of the areas of focus or niches inside the agency? So if you think about it in 3 categories, is the agency growing? Can it do it profitably? And is the agency transferable? Are the big overarching things that determine what the value of that agency is. So you could have the same size agency, let's say $1 million in revenue agency, where one is not growing and one is growing double digits, or one is able to profit at a 40% profitability and the other one's operating at a 10% profitability, or one of those agencies has one account that makes up 40% of the book while the other one has no accounts that are more than 1% of the book. All of those factors would change the value of those two agencies even though both of them have $1 million in revenue. So just think about that. You have to go deeper than just one number to understand what drives the value of an agency and how you would structure buying or selling that agency as well. So we're going to talk about what are all those things, dig in a little bit, maybe help you think a little bit differently about your own agency or an agency that you might be thinking about acquiring, and make a decision that is much more stronger than just looking at that revenue level. So let's dig in. While we know growth, profitability, and transferability are the overarching, here's some other factors that many agency owners need to consider as they're thinking about what impacts the value of an agency. So we already talked about growth and profitability. Growth, for an agency to maximize its value, they need to at least be in double-digit growth numbers, especially in the market that we're in today. In fact, that number used to be right around 7.9%. And these numbers change based on the size of the agency. So I'm going to use some general numbers here. But now double-digit growth is what we look for to put people in categories and really maximize the value of their agency. In the hard market, revenue growth has actually been pretty high given the fact that rate has helped. But knowing what's happening with your growth from a retention standpoint and an organic green new growth is really helpful to know what's driving that growth. If an agency is just growing based on rate and they're not paying attention to the fact that they're losing customers, that growth is not the same as an agency that's actually growing organically and by rate. So you have to be able to demonstrate knowledge and performance in that category that shows strength, not necessarily some hidden weaknesses of the agency. Profitability, the average agency that comes to us that is an S Corp operates somewhere between a 17 and maybe 20% profitability on their own. When we adjust their profitability going through a valuation process, many times that profitability is hovering somewhere around 28 to 32% profitability. And then stellar performers are even higher than that. So if you're thinking about how do I compare, remember, based on your structure, you might have a different tax strategy for your agency on how you operate every day. When we think about the value of your agency, we think about what could the agency be operating at if we removed any discretionary expenses, one-time expenses, it right-sized the owner compensation and got to a pro forma profitability or pro forma EBITDA. That's really what we're looking at when we're valuing an agency. While size and the overall volume of the agency does matter, it's not the only thing that matters, but agencies that are of a greater size typically can command a higher multiple simply because the percentage of that agency at their size is different than someone who's much smaller. So that is a factor. The strength of the book and the quality of the book is something that's important. So an agency that is 100% personal lines with an owner that maybe is in their 80s, that book quality may not be as strong as an agency that has multiple producers writing personal lines in all generations. Therefore, that book's predictability is different than someone who has been here a long time and is the main producer. So the quality of the book, the age of the clients could be a challenge. There's lots of different things to think about there. And I'm giving one example. Your staff is one of your biggest, it is your biggest asset inside your agency. It's also your largest expense. So the quality of your staff, the demographic of your staff is something to think about. The agency's technology stack and the efficiency of the agency driven by that technology is really important thing to think about. So that is a factor that you need to take into consideration as you're thinking about acquiring another agency. Them being on a different technology or not being as tech forward as your agency could be a cultural fit that would be a problem, or it could be a strength. But that compatibility of what the expectation is, how technology plays a role inside your agency and how your staff, when combined with staff of another agency, will be able to mesh is incredibly important. So many of these things interwork with each other and are things that you need to think about when you think about maximizing the value of your agency and how transferable it is. Then that strategic fit. If you're an agency that writes only personal lines and you're going to look to acquire another agency that's heavy commercial lines, you might be outside your scope of how to integrate that and what your staff's expectation would be when trying to integrate an agency that's that different. Or there might be a niche-based agency where it might not be as easy to integrate into your everyday processes inside your agency. So that strategic fit is incredibly important from both the buyer and seller's perspective. If you're a coastal agency looking to buy an agency that is more, in the Midwest, you might think differently because your carriers won't have crossover, and you might have difficulty getting into a market, understanding that market, and gaining access to those carriers that don't have experience with you. So strategic fit matters. And all over this, we're talking about transferability. Will the ongoing performance of the agency, will it be expected to continue where it is, or are there things that would cause that ongoing performance of the agency either increase or decrease based on what would change during that transition, or the things that you should be thinking about? So we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to each of these areas. So how can you assess your own agency's health to determine where can I maximize my own agency's value, and where should you start? Well, number one, an agency is, for many people, their largest asset. And if it's not their absolute largest assets, it's probably in the top 5 of their largest assets of the things that they own. So you should get a health check of your agency at a minimum, just to understand where you are and be able to look at your agency, not from inside and doing the day to day, but from the outside. What does the health of my agency look like? You could do that in 2 ways. You could benchmark your agency, or you could get a full valuation of your agency. I recommend that everybody have a valuation of their agency as a baseline before they want to do anything, before they want to sell their agency, before they want to buy an agency, before they want to transition internally. Having a reasonable understanding of your own agency allows you to see where your strengths are, where your weaknesses might be, where the areas of opportunity are, and just gives you a gut check of how you compare to other agencies your size. So if you've not done that, we get health checkups of our car, of our, appliances in our house. We do it for our own health, but we sometimes don't do it for our largest asset. So I highly recommend making sure that you do that. And if that's not something you could do, what could you do without outside resources? You could take a look at your financials and assess where you stand compared to other agencies your size, again, just to get that gut check. We are fortunate to be in an industry where there are a lot of benchmarks. There's a lot of metrics that are available to us that we can start to consider. But in order to use those benchmarks, you have to have your financials organized the same way that the benchmarks are organized. So I have a tool for you for that. But number one, look at your financials, look at your P&L, map them to the benchmarks so you're comparing apples and apples. Then you can look at a 3-year trend of your agency. How do I compare to other agencies this size? Do I have peaks and valleys in what I'm doing year over year? And are there one-time expenditures that I can remove in order to get to what is that ongoing profitability of my agency? The other thing is, I run a small business. Lots of agencies have discretionary expenses inside their agencies. Some expenses that are being run through the agency for a tax purpose, not necessarily as a directly related to selling and servicing your clients. So identifying what those discretionary expenses are and getting a total of those discretionary expenses sometimes can identify opportunities to be able to reallocate some of those resources to areas that might enhance your growth rate or your ability to invest in producers. It might enhance your ability to know what your overall profitability could be. It might enhance your ability to make other investments that make, in the long run, make your agency more valuable. But thinking about them in small transactions, you might have an additional car that runs through your agency, or a subscription, or a membership somewhere, or whatever these small decisions might be. There could be travel or meals, sometimes the insurance related to a building that you own, etc., could be running through your P&L. And without adding all of those up and seeing the full impact, you really don't know how you could potentially reallocate those resources. That's sometimes one of the most enlightening exercises that agency owners do in order to see the potential of what I could do to maximize the value of my agency over a period of time, especially if you're getting close to potentially transitioning to another person inside the agency, the next generation, or selling externally, and make some decisions 5 years prior to that in order to maximize the value of the agency. So we're going to map to the benchmarks. We're going to look for trends. We're going to identify those discretionary expenses or peaks, one-time expenditures or revenue in order to get to, and then compare them to the benchmark and say, do I spend the same amount that other agency owners do on compensation? Do I spend the same amount that other agency owners do on technology or marketing? And is my investment in those areas getting me the same results as other agencies? So am I growing as fast as other agencies that are making these investments? And therefore, are these investments giving me the return that I should expect? So for instance, if you're an agency that when you map all of this and you compare to the benchmarks, let's say your technology costs 5% of your revenue and the average agency owner is only spending 3% of their revenue on technology. Well, what's causing that difference? And are you growing much faster than the average? Therefore, that investment makes a lot of sense. Or are you able to operate your agency with less payroll than the average agency because your technology is creating more efficiency than another agency? So you can start asking some strategic questions about your own agency when you have these benchmarks as a guide. So while the benchmark isn't the end all be all, it gives you the guardrails to start asking questions about your agency in a different way. So we have our first question. I'll give you guys a second to answer those, and then I will keep moving on. All right. Hopefully you guys had a chance to answer the poll. Fantastic. Okay, so now that we have this is the categories. If you're saying that's great, Carey, but I have absolutely no idea if my profit and loss statement is organized in the same way that the benchmarks are, this is actually a tool that you can download and it'll tell you how to map your profit and loss statement into the standard benchmarks that exist in the industry in order to be able to do what I just said. This is a free tool. You can download it, use it as much as you'd like. And once you do this exercise, you can organize your statements to actually print out exactly like the industry standard. So where do you get the benchmarks to compare to? There's a publication that is put out by the Big I National. Every single year, it's called the Best Practices Study, that you can go and buy this report and then use those benchmarks to compare to your agency. When we value an agency, we actually compare you to our benchmarks. So AgencyFocus does somewhere around 200 valuations a year. We have compiled our own benchmarks to make sure that we know exactly what that looks like. But there's several sources in order to get these benchmarks. But I would tell you, number one, once you have this data, it's powerful to then start making other decisions about your agency. Without it, you have no idea how you compare. And the reality is, when you start an independent insurance agency, there's no real guidebook that says, here's the decisions you need to make, and here's the way that it's done. I'm not suggesting that these benchmarks are that, but at least they're guardrails to give context to the decisions you're making. So remember, the equation for evaluation is EBITDA times the multiple equals the value. So EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So rather than a multiple of revenue, we speak in a multiple of EBITDA in order to talk about the value of an agency. And that EBITDA is just a fancy acronym for operating profit. So if you look at your financial statement, this is a number I think everybody should know, but it's not a number that shows up on your P&L and is printed on everybody's report. You have to do some calculations to get there. So at the end of your P&L, there is a profit and loss line item at the bottom of your P&L, that is the number you start with. That's your revenue less all of your expenses gives you your profit or loss. And then from there, you start adding and subtracting based on the things on your P&L, on your profit and loss statement. So if you have a loan and you pay interest expense, you would add that back because it's not an operating expense. You would add back any taxes you pay to the IRS or your state based on the profitability of your agency, not an operating expense. You would add back any depreciation expense or amortization expense that shows up on your P&L because that is not an ongoing operating expense. It's an accounting calculation that's done based on the fixed assets that you have or any intangible assets that you have. Then any one-time expenses that are not going to recur, things like rebranding your agency, buying a sign, changing all your equipment, a AMS transition, maybe a one-time thing that you're investing in training inside your agency, but it's not something you're going to do every single year. Any one-time expenditure that's large enough that's skewing your numbers year to year, you would remove that because that's not going to continue into the future. Any one-time income, same thing. If it's not going to recur in the future, you have to remove it or subtract it. So something like maybe you sold a car or that was an asset of the agency. So you had, profit on a sale of an asset, or maybe you sold a book of business. That's not going to continue. Maybe you had a PPP loan. Lots of us had those. So you got to make sure that anything that's one time that's not going to continue into the future, you take out of the equation. You add back your discretionary expenses because, again, if you were really making a decision about buying or selling, those discretionary expenses could be reallocated and really should be counted in the operating profit of the agency. And then you would right size your owner compensation to a reasonable amount. Owners pay themselves all different ways. They can pay themselves by W-2, by distribution, and depending on your tax strategy and your tax structure and your CPA's recommendation, there you could be putting more or less on your W-2 income than the average agency. So putting a reasonable amount of owner compensation in this calculation will get you to the reasonable EBITDA calculation for your agency. So knowing what this is, you can then say, am I operating in that range where I should be, or is there some decision inside my agency that I should think differently about? And lots of people want to talk about the multiples in our industry because it's exciting. They've increased and almost doubled in the last 15 years. Private equity coming in has caused those multiples to stay pretty high, but not a lot of people walk around and talk about the EBITDA of their agency or how it compares to others. But what's interesting is those are the two numbers that are multiplied together to get to the value of an agency. And the EBITDA is actually what an agency owner controls 100%. It's all based on your decisions. The multiple is really dictated by the market and the risk inside your agency. So you have some influence on that multiple, but the market really drives that. The EBITDA is what you can do the most about, and also pay attention to some of the risk inside your agency to maximize that multiple as well. So knowing this number puts you in the driver's seat and makes you think about your business in a different way. So knowing what your profitability is and what your organic growth is incredibly important. I would just tell you, organic growth is not your total revenue compared to your total revenue last year divided by your revenue of last year. You have to only use your commission and fee income, or you could skew what your growth rate is when you're comparing it to other agencies' growth rates or what the standard should be. So when you're thinking about organic growth, you have to remove any acquisitions that you've done, any contingency income, any income that, again, is not predictable, like bond income or life insurance income, because those things don't renew the same way as other agencies are. So you have to think about what is consistent and then compare it to the previous year to get that organic growth rate over time. Same thing with your profitability. So just make sure when you're calculating your growth rate and your profitability overall that you're contemplating some of those things that you need to remove, or make sure you're not skewing the number. I had one agency that in their revenue number, their contingencies were all put in there by carrier, and there was never a number um, that could tell you the difference between their commission and fee income and their contingencies. So when they calculated their growth rate, they had a really big negative year and they couldn't understand why. And it was because they had a big loss and their contingencies dropped significantly, even though the agency was growing. So you want to make sure that you're not skewing your numbers, and making sure that you're not thinking about it in a different way. So someone asked if you're going to get these slides. Absolutely. I'm happy to provide the slides to everyone who attended the session. And if you have questions along the way, I encourage you to ask those as we're going. And just anything that you have on your mind, slow me down. I'm happy to answer anything at all. Okay. All right. Although multitasking can be a challenge for me, so bear with me. Anyway, so now that you know your organic growth, you need to ask yourself, where is that organic growth coming from? Is it coming from one producer? Is it coming from you, the owner, because you are the main producer inside your agency? Is it likely to continue in a transition? Is it concentrated in one area, one niche, one carrier, one source, maybe even one referral source for you? So you just want to think about, where is it coming from, and is there risk if something changes inside the agency? So I was at a conference on Monday and I was talking to an agency owner, and he said, I don't think I have a lot of risk. Honestly, I'm a producer. I'm not a very good business owner, but I'm a producer, and most of the new business comes from me. And then I have a whole bunch of account managers that manage the book, but I really write all the new business. And I said, well, if something happens to you and I bought your agency, even though you're growing at 17.5%, that's great. But what would cause that growth rate to continue? And he said, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, there's your risk factor. You need to have another way to make sure that the agency will continue to be able to maintain that performance, because it's an area of strength for you, but it would be at risk if you personally weren't there, because people are doing business with you because of you. You have the relationships. You're out in the industry. You have the referral sources, relationships. You are the one that is writing the articles, etc. So he thought about it a little differently, but in his mind, it was actually not risky because there's no chance of him leaving the agency like a producer may. And I understand his thought process, but if he got sick and wasn't able to come to work, it would definitely change the value of that agency. So just think about risk in that way. And sometimes getting a valuation allows you to start analyzing your own risk inside your agency in a different way, to think about, oh, what could I do to mitigate that? What could I do to introduce other people to have the relationships that they would stay if one thing in the agency changed? So let's talk about what is the risks inside your agency. There are actually three categories of risk. There is risk by concentration, risk by performance, and risk that's considered cultural risk. So the concentration risk is the first one that's easy to think about. I've been talking about it a little bit as we're going through here, but it's really and so the areas of risk are concentration, performance, and culture. And then all of them, you got to think about, how do they impact the transferability and predictability of your agency? And the reason private equity and many, many buyers inside the reason there are, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1 buyers to sellers inside our agency is because agencies are typically very predictable and very good investments. That transferability and predictability is what is really important. Everybody has a different degree of transferability and predictability, though, based on the makeup of your agency and the decisions you've made. So for all of these risk factors, you have to ask yourself, is this an area where my agency would continue to be very predictable, or is this an area where we might have questions about the ongoing predictability of the performance of the agency should something change. And so let's talk about an area of concentration that I've already touched on a little bit with my first example, but it's ownership concentration. So one of the fastest ways that an independent insurance agency sells at a discount is a single owner past the age of retirement that has no plan. And the reason for that is there will be a delay in decisions in order to continue to operate that agency if no plan is established. And people have to scramble to figure out how to fill the shoes of an agency owner that has a sudden life event and there's no plan in place. So the weighted average shareholder age today of agency owners across the country. There are 39,000 independent insurance agencies, and the weighted average shareholder age for agencies is about 56. So that means that about 17% of all independent insurance agencies are currently over the age of 65. And in the next 5 years, all baby boomers will be at retirement age, knowing that there's a transition of ownership that's coming. They call it the silver tsunami when it comes to agency owners. We know that somewhere around 50% of independent insurance agencies believe that they will transition ownership of their agency in the next 5 to 10 years. At least 20% of that ownership will be transitioned. Lots of movement in the industry simply because of the average age of independent insurance agencies. There's also a lot of change happening in our industry with the pressure of having to operate more efficiently, utilize technology, the hard market with the volume of work. So a lot of agency owners that are approaching retirement age aren't sure that they want to take on how the massive changes that are coming because of technology, AI, et cetera. So there's more agencies asking themselves, multiples have never been higher. There's a lot of change happening. I'm approaching the age of retirement. Might this be my high? Might this be the right time for me to transition? There's lots of challenges around that. But if an owner has all the relationships and is producing owner, not staying with the agency through a transition could cause your agency not to sell at the highest value, because if you wait too long and you don't want to stay and transition those relationships, the ongoing retention of your book could be at question. So really, number one, having a plan would reduce your risk if something sudden happened to an agency owner, because you wouldn't want your staff to get nervous and think, I need to leave if something happens to my owner. You also don't want your staff to get nervous because they know you're approaching retirement age and they don't know what your plan is. And they're thinking, I might need to find a job in advance because I don't know who I'll be working for. So if you have thoughts of perpetuating internally, start talking to your staff about there's an opportunity for them, before you lose great staff. But having a plan that says who to talk to, what your wishes are, having someone that can help your team or your family through how to transition or sell your agency should something happen to you, can actually minimize the time that it'll take to make those decisions and minimize the anxiety and risk that would occur that might cause your staff to think about leaving, which could then cause your customers to think about leaving and potentially your carriers to get nervous in that. Um, Ownership concentration, there's a tendency for some owners to maintain all of the accounting, payroll, etc. So whatever the owner does and is the only person that can do it, documenting those procedures and cross-training some of the key roles can minimize the risk of the owner concentration as well, or the owner responsibilities. Outsourcing payroll, outsourcing commission reconciliation can again mitigate that risk and cause it to be continuous, whether something happens to the agency owner or not. So just ask yourself, if something happened to me as the owner, could the agency function for a period of time? Or are there key players inside the agency that we would need to cross-train, document, etc., to make sure that the agency can continue to operate without a lot of without a lot of disruption, and document how you'd gain access to the places you needed to do those jobs, any carrier portals, bank accounts, systems, etc. I had an agency that had three owners. They thought they had mitigated this risk because there was three of them. And they used to joke with me and say, hey, we need to get that valuation done sometimes, but we're not ready to sell. We'll wait till closer to the time to sell in order to get that valuation. And, every time they saw me, they would joke and say, yeah, 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 next year we'll do that. Well, on one Saturday morning, I was really good friends with these agency owners, and one of them called me and said, it was a Saturday morning. I was surprised to hear from them. And I answered the phone and I'm like, you ready for your valuation? And his voice cracked. And he said, I'm not. Well, actually, I am, but I'm calling to tell you that one of the three agency owners passed away. He was actually the youngest of the three, and he was the one that did all of the accounting work for the agency. The other two owners didn't even have logins in order to do all of the work that he did, and they had no idea how to do the work. So even though there were three of them, they segmented their roles in such a way and did not think about having any redundancy with each other. And that was one of the problems. The second problem was they were thinking of selling externally in 5 years, and his suddenly passing away caused him to they would have to buy him out internally, and what's the differential in price and how would they handle that. So they were really in a panic and wanted to make sure that they did the right thing by him, his wife, his family, and not having that baseline valuation, they were worried that they would have some trouble. So I would just tell you, be prepared, make sure you know where your areas of concentration are, especially even if you have multiple owners, thinking about what that's like inside your own agency. It's not the same agency to agency, it's really different, and you got to think about it from your perspective. The next one is carrier concentration. In the hard market, I don't have to make this point as much as I used to have to make it when it was a soft market, but having more than 25% of your book of business with one carrier creates some risk if that carrier changes their appetite, their ability to write new business, their compensation structure, their anything. So having 25% of your entire book with one carrier does create some risk, even if it's a strong carrier. The second risk factor is, do you have too many carriers where you're spread too thin and you're not maximizing what you could do from a contingency standpoint with each of your carriers? Do you have depth? If you have any niche or any area that you write, but you only have one or two choices in your carriers and they both stop writing new business or stop, maybe they're not competitive anymore as the market changes. So having depth within the carriers inside your areas of focus is incredibly important. Your ability to move business between carriers is important. The rating of the carrier is important, and the likelihood that that carrier will change their appetite, commission rates, contingency, etc. Being part of a network, cluster, or alliance does mitigate some of the risk that I talked about with carriers. It can give you access to markets that you won't have to maintain a certain amount for each carrier that you would on your own. It could also maximize your contingency without having to hit the minimum thresholds individually as an agency. So many agencies are leveraging the power of a network or a cluster in order to minimize this risk. But taking a look at it, I had one agency that was going to buy another agency, and they were in the same state. And we did an analysis to show the overlap of their carrier placement. And they found out that between them, they actually represented or had business with over 80 carriers. And when we compared them, they only had 5 carriers that they overlapped with. So that would be a lot of work in order to, if they don't get appointments with all those carriers, a lot of work to rewrite that business where they needed it to be. So being spread over a lot of carriers can sometimes create complexity, especially in this market where a lot of carriers are not handing out new contracts, even in an acquisition situation. So making sure you keep your arms around this and maximize your carrier relationships and think about that. It can actually put you in the driver's seat significantly as an agency. Your customer concentration, we take a look at your customer list, we look at your top 10 accounts, we look at what percentage is with one customer, what percentage is in the top 10, the overall number of your customers and the policies per customer, as well as the average size per customer, in order to assess the risk there. Some of the additional things, if we can get the average age of a customer, we can definitely take a look at the health of the book in a different way. Also look at how many customers by niche. So you can really start digging in and looking at this risk in many different ways, but at a minimum, know how big your largest customer is. And from a buyer standpoint, would that create risk that they might put a retention clause on that customer if they bought your agency? So making sure you understand what that looks like can really change what your approach will be with an agency. So customer concentration is pretty straightforward. You want no more than 5% with one customer and no more than 25% with your overall top 10 customers. So that's the rule of thumb. Again, the largest I've ever seen is 40% with one customer. That obviously is not, the risk that you want. Same thing with producer concentration. What percentage of the overall written premiums is one producer? Do they have specialized expertise? What is their age, the nature of relationship with the agencies and with their customer? So is there exposure of the agency in the account, or is it only with this producer? And might that be a problem if that producer leaves? Do you have a lot of service people also involved in that account that build relationships with that person and with the agency? So knowing what that is and then starting to round out the exposure in some of your key customers is incredibly important. Whether or not you have contracts with your producers to make sure that there's non-solicit, non-piracy language inside those contracts with everybody inside your agency, not just producers, will protect your book of business and the predictability of your agency. Without that, it actually creates some risk that if someone left, there is no repercussion if they solicit your accounts if you don't have contracts in place. One of the ways to strengthen an agency is provide a pathway to ownership for some of your key employees to make sure they stay with the agency and don't decide to go out and start their own agency. So there's ways to mitigate that risk, and one of the ways to do that is creating a pathway to ownership. We talked about you know I don't know if one of the ways that agencies are getting really efficient is to focus on a niche rather than being generalists. So as of today, 64% of independent insurance agents that answered the Agency Universe report that is done by the Big I said yes, they have a defined niche. 55% of independent agencies do not specialize in a specific industry. They are generalist agencies. So there were two questions that were written. So I would just say agencies that are generalists can be profitable. There's no two ways around that. But one of the strategies to maximize efficiency is to get really focused with your niche or get really focused on something that you can get crazy efficient in that. Think about the technology that you need, the carrier relationships that you need, the expertise that you need, allowing you to focus and make things much more streamlined. That is a strategy for some agencies. When you think about it, you do have to think about, as I do that, I could be creating risk based on environmental factors, the nature of the business, the volatility of that area of focus. So it's not a one size fits all here. It's really an overall strategy that you need to think about. And if you think about that, make sure that you have many people that have the expertise to serve that niche, many people that have different ways to maintain that. Can it transfer easily? But it should create some profitability and growth. And what are the carrier markets that you need in order to maintain that niche? So this is a two-sided thing, but that's definitely a strategy that many agencies are thinking about. From performance, we just went through concentration, which is a big risk factor. But from a performance standpoint, Really, retention is the biggest performance number that people need to pay attention to. And you need to know what your performance is or your retention is from a revenue standpoint, as well as a customer standpoint, especially in this hard market. From a revenue retention standpoint, you could think it's over 100% for many agencies because of rate. Not knowing what this number is really could be deceiving. And it's hard to calculate because many of the agency management systems do not help you in this category. And if you don't have the right processes capturing your rewrites appropriately, it can skew your new business and your lost business when a rewrite is actually written new to the carrier when it downloads. If you don't have a process to catch that, your retention numbers could be really off. So this is an area where many agencies struggle to report this accurately, but it's an incredibly important number to know. And remember, you want to know it by revenue, by policy or customer or policies in force or customer, and by premium volume. Really important to know your retention because then it can tell you what do I need to do to improve my retention. Many agencies are using an NPS score to know what their customers think of them. Knowing your policies per customer is a predictor of your retention. The more policies per customer, the less likelihood that you're going to lose some of your accounts. The number of monoline accounts, if you've got a high percentage of your accounts that are monoline, your book will be considered more transient than other agencies. It will also give you the cross-sell opportunity of your book. And if you tier your agencies and think about them differently, it could create some capacity on your agency and really think about between your NPS score and your customer tiering, where should my people spend their most time for the biggest impact in my agency? So knowing what your customers think about you and getting that net promoter score can allow you to not think of, I'm just going to do the same thing to everybody, but prioritize time, and so can customer tiering. Your loss ratio is a performance metric that is incredibly important. It can be really important when you're looking to acquire another book because you could operate at a really low loss ratio. You could think, oh, I'm going to add volume that allows me to have contingency, but find that their underwriting guidelines and your underwriting guidelines are different, and they put what the compensation that you get by contingency at risk. So really think about what's the trend by carrier, what's the overall impact to the agency and contingency relationship. If you are looking at another book, what's driving their losses and the likelihood that that will improve before you think about adding your books together. But knowing what that loss ratio is incredibly important, and it can help you in picking the niches that you want to think about. So what's your biggest asset? It's also your biggest expense is your people. And that is an incredibly important thing to pay attention to. In this silver tsunami that's happening, it's not just owners that are aging, producers and service. If I get asked at least 12 times a day, where do I find a commercial lines account manager? Where can I find a great personal lines account manager? There's not a day that goes by that I don't talk to agency owners that are looking to hire those roles because they know they have people that are going to retire in their agency. So making sure you really think about your team, what that demographic is, what the compensation structure is, the contracts you have in place. Producer-owned books are one of the most common things that can slow down a sale and complicate a transaction. And then really calculating what that capacity is of your team and what you should expect the capacity of your team to be given the investments you're making in tiering your accounts, automation, technology, etc. Best practices gives you an average size book that each type of service person should be able to manage. The only caveat is they don't know what structure you have with your technology, automation, etc. And then you could use that as a guide and then add or subtract based on the investments you've made inside your agency to create efficiency. But it's a really nice gut check to know what should I expect my agency to operate at. If you don't know what an NPS score is, here's an example of what an NPS score looks like. This is an agency's dashboard of their NPS score, which is one survey that's sent out to say, would you recommend our agency to all of their customers? For them, they had sent out 3,124 surveys that asked that simple question, would you recommend us? And they got 996 responses, and their responses were categorized into three categories: promoters, passive, and detractors. The promoters gave them a 9 or 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. Yes, we would refer you. And those people, they immediately were sent, will you give us a Google review? For the ones that gave them an 8 or a 7, they were considered passive. They're not a promoter of the agency, they're not a detractor, and you might have your team reach out to them and find out why they aren't a promoter. But the biggest concern are the detractors. They gave them a 6 or below, which means they're not super happy with the agency. And those are the people that you need to reach out to and find out, what can we do better? Where did we fall down? What do we need to do? They could also see what was their average NPS score for the agency was 82.3. What was it by each of their top carriers? What was it by each of the producers that are assigned to those accounts? And what happened? What was the last thing that happened with those agency or those customers that got a certain NPS score? So, got to be careful with data though, because it looks like producer E had a problem when in fact producer E was actually, most of their book was with carrier E. And really the problem was with the responsiveness of carrier E that was causing the NPS score to go down. But having this line of sight allowed this agency to think about who they needed to reach out to and what they needed to do, and which ones were detractors and what they needed to do to create, to pay attention and make sure that their retention didn't suffer because they know what their agency, what their customers think about that. So again, that's one of the metrics. If you aren't using an NPS score or some way to know what your customers think about you, you're at a disadvantage. You're just going to treat everybody exactly the same. The revenue per producer and revenue per employee are metrics that we use to really think about capacity and projected profitability of the agency, because your compensation per employee, revenue per producer, and revenue per employee, this is all about capacity and thinking about, should we be expecting or should we be hiring for our agency, or are we in a place where we're good to go? I'm going the wrong way, so sorry. Wow, what is happening right now? Hold on. Okay. For agencies that don't have this, I think one of the best things you could do is put a perpetuation plan in place. It is the largest risk inside your agency. If you haven't written things down, we've created a very simple guide to document the things that you should write down. Who's the lawyer they should call? Who's your accountant? What are your account numbers? What are the logins? What do you want to do? Who are the people they should contact, as and other agents inside the industry that you would love to help your family through if they don't know what they're doing and haven't been inside the agency. It's a really simple guide. I think if there's two things that I could solve inside this industry to help agencies maximize their value, is number one, have a perpetuation plan. Number two, know your retention and make sure that you shore up any area of your retention, because that's really what's driving the value of your agency, that predictability of renewable income. And if you know that, you are in the driver's seat and you're much better off than the average agency that doesn't know that number. So please take advantage of that. If there's anything that we can do to help you with that, I would love to. I would just ask you, if you think this is your high, make sure that you're maximizing what you can do for your agency and get that health check. Look at your agency in a really unique way and make sure that you're thinking about, how do I maximize my value, and think about the value of your agency in a different way. So that is where I'm going to end things. If anyone has any questions, I would love to answer your questions. If you want to reach out and talk about anything specific that we just talked about today, I'm happy to do that. This is my QR code where you can reach out and talk to anybody on our team. We're a partner with the Big I there, and everybody has a free 30 minutes to talk to anybody on our team about any of the things that we talked about today. And I would love to help you in any way we can. Mary Pat, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, Carrie, thank you, thank you, thank you. You once again were wonderful, and I think we'll probably get requests to keep having you come back to share your information with our team here. So
Awesome.
much appreciated, and thank you all for spending your last hour with us. Again, Carrie will get me the slide deck, and I'll make sure that that gets sent out to you. I will process your CE, and you'll get your certificate of completion. And again, hopefully everyone got the survey popping up or will pop up on your screen when you exit the webinar. And again, just please take a minute to do the affidavit there. So have a great day and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mary Pat.
All right. Thank you, Carrie.